What was it like flying the Black Dread? You were Balerian's last rider.
Only for a short time, before he died. With Balerion died the last memory of Valyria of old.
But Vhagar still lives. Somewhere.
When Aegon Targaryen set forth from Dragonstone to conquer the Seven Kingdoms, the only right he had to call himself king had scales, horns, wings, and breathed fire. 3 heads had the dragon. Aegon rode Balerion, Rhaenys, Meraxes, and their elder, Visenya, Vhagar. Hatched half a century earlier on the island of Dragonstone during the Century of Blood following the doom of Valyria, she was named after a god of the Valyrian freehold. But all that is known to us is that Vhagar, bronze with greenish-blue highlights and bright green eyes, bonded with Visenya Targaryen not long before she married her brother. Then, after Aegon landed on Westeros at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, the Targaryen host divided and set swiftly on securing the neighboring lands. Visenya flew to Stockworth, where the castle defenders gave her little opposition once Vhagar set the roof on fire. Afterwards, atop the highest of 3 hills near the small fishing village where they had landed, stood a crude wooden earth castle they named the Aegon Fort. There, in the place where one day would stand the Red Keep of King's Landing, and in front of his new subjects, Vhagar's rider placed a crown on Aegon's head, and her sister Rhaenys proclaimed him Aegon, first of his name, king of all Westeros and shield of his people. This would be the first of the 2 coronations of Aegon the Conqueror. Later, Visenya and Vhagar accompanied the Targaryen fleet commanded by Daemon Balerion to take Goldtown, where the battle was almost lost until Vhagar descended to turn the Arryn fleet to ashes. Next was Cracklow Point, where many of the local lords pledged fealty to Visenya at the sight of Vhagar. At Stony Sept, a town in the Riverlands, Visenya reunited with her siblings and the Targaryen army advanced south. What followed was the most decisive and well-known battle of the War of Conquest. In the Field of Fire, as singers would call it, Loren Lannister I, King of the Rock, and Mern Gardener IX, King of the Reach, joined forces against the Dragonlords. With roughly 55,000 men, they exceeded the Targaryen army 5-1. But when Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar took to the sky, the only time in which all 3 Targaryen dragons entered a battlefield at the same time, 4,000 men burned to their death, including King Mern and all his kin, ending House Gardener. However, once the outcome of the battle was set, Loren Lannister fled the Dragonflame to later yield and become the First Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. Then Aegon, his sisters, and their dragons flew to the Trident to face the advancing army of the king in the north, Torrhen Stark. But unlike other kings, it did not come easy to Stark to subject his people to Dragonflame. And so, at the price of his pride, he took a knee and forever became the king who knelt. After that, Visenya rode Vhagar to the Vale, where she put the claim of the Eyrie being impregnable to the test by simply landing Vhagar in the inner courtyard of the castle. When the Queen Regent Shara Arryn entered the courtyard, she found her royal son, the King of Mountain and Vale, sitting on Visenya's knee, gaping at her dragon. The Queen bent the knee, and little Ronald Arryn got to fly 3 times around the summit of the Giant's Lands with Visenya on Vhagar's back. Unfortunately, some lands would prove to be much more difficult to conquer. Of the 7 kingdoms, only Dorne had successfully resisted the Targaryen rule, and its people did so for many years throughout several attempts. But on the 10th year of Aegon's reign at Hellhold, a bolt found the eye of the dragon Meraxes, and she fell from the sky, along with her rider, Queen Rhaenys. History remembers the following 2 years as the dragons wrought. Aegon atop Balerion and Visenya atop Vhagar burned every Dornish stronghold at least once, save Sunspear itself. The war ended 3 years later in 13 AC when Aegon signed a peace treaty with Prince Naemor Martell, but Dorne remained independent. Decades later, the 37-year reign of Aegon the Conqueror came to its end. When the king died, it was Vhagar's flame who lighted the fire of the funeral pyre. He was succeeded by his son Aenys, and a few years into his reign, he named his eldest son Prince of Dragonstone, an unofficial title at the time, but one held up to that point by Visenya's son, Maegor, who had been exiled. At the announcement, Visenya rose from the table and left angrily for Dragonstone. It is said that when Vhagar passed through the moon, it turned red as blood. Then, during the uprising of the Faith Militant, Aenys escaped to Dragonstone. Visenya asked him to grant her leave to take Vhagar and burn the Staricept of Old Town, which Aenys refused. But when he died in early 42 AC, Visenya left with Vhagar within the hour and flew to Pentos, where her son lived. Maegor, who wrote Balerion after his father, came back to Dragonstone, but only long enough to claim Aenys' crown. Visenya accompanied him upon Vhagar, and they crossed Blackwater Bay. The return of both dragons to King's Landing set off riots in the city. A year later, despite their losses, the Faith Militant continued to resist Maegor's reign. Visenya mounted Vhagar and raised the seats of many noble houses in the Riverlands, while Maegor atop Balerion did the same in the Westerlands. This served to punish the pious lords who had defied the royal summons, and were most likely lending support to the rebels. The following year, the Targaryens turned towards Old Town and threatened to burn the Staricept, but the mysterious death of the High Septon at the last hour saved the city from Dragonflame. Again. In 44 AC, at 3 and 70 years of age, the Queen Dowager died, and Vhagar was left without a rider. She remained unridden for nearly 30 years, until Prince Balon the Brave, the fourth son of Jaehaerys Targaryen I, the Old King, who in his youth had succeeded Maegor, claimed her in 72 AC. A decade later, Balon atop Vhagar, his father Jaehaerys atop Vermithor, and his older brother Aemon atop Caraxes, born the Dornish fleet that attempted to invade the Stormlands during the Fourth Dornish War. The Targaryens didn't lose a single man. Then, another decade later, Prince Aemon, brother of Balon and heir to the throne, was slain on Tarth by Myrish exiles in 92 AC. Balon mounted Vhagar and flew to Tarth to avenge his brother, and like Vhagar's first rider, he went into battle wielding the famed Valyrian sword, Dark Sister. When Balerion, the Black Dread, died of old age in 94 AC, Vhagar became the last of the 3 Targaryen dragons who had fought in the conquest, and the oldest and largest of the living dragons. But a few years later, in 101 AC, she became riderless again, when Balon, the Brave, hand of the king at the time, died of a burst belt. Vhagar's next known rider was Laena Velaryon, who claimed the She-Dragon before her 12th name day. When Laena wed Prince Daemon Targaryen in 115 AC, they crossed the Narrow Sea and traveled across the Free Cities, where huge crowds gathered everywhere they went to catch a glimpse of Vhagar and Caraxes, now ridden by Daemon. Laena gave birth a year later in 116 AC and sailed with her twin daughters back to Driftmark, while Daemon flew both Caraxes and Vhagar back to Westeros. Later, in 120 AC, Laena died after giving birth to a malformed son, who died within the hour of birth. It is said that she attempted to reach Vhagar to fly one more time before she died, but collapsed before reaching her. However, this time Vhagar wouldn't be without a rider for long. Following Laena's funeral, Daemon's nephew, Aemon, claimed Vhagar for his own. At the start of the conflict, the singers stopped the Dance of the Dragons. Vhagar was the hardened survivor of 100 battles, and had grown nearly as large as Balerion was during the conquest. No living dragon could match her for size or ferocity. Aemon flew Vhagar to Storm's End to secure the support of House Baratheon for King Aegon II, but Prince Lucerys Velaryon arrived shortly thereafter for Queen Rhaenyra. Enmity between both branches of House Targaryen had simmered for many years, and a decade prior, in a child's quarrel, Lucerys had taken one of Aemon's eye with a dagger while trying to protect his older brother, Jaehaerys. Aemon felt a debt was owed and tried to provoke Lucerys into a fight by demanding that he take out his own eye. The Lord of Storm's End intervened, but once outside, Lucerys on Arrax and Aemon on Vhagar met above Shipbreaker Bay. If there was a fight, it must have been short, for Vhagar was many times the size of Arrax, who had never flown into battle besides. The young dragon's severed head washed up on shore 3 days later, and Prince Lucerys' body was never found. This ended the War of Parchment and Ink, and started the war in earnest, a war that would engulf the realm in fire and blood. And Vhagar, that hoary old bitch, part of the original 3-headed dragon in flesh as in heraldry, who was there from the War of Conquest, a conquest made possible by the might of dragons, will be there when that might ends.
Valar Dohaeris.